Hi, this is the Histories Inc. podcast, and I'm Mallory Nye. Thanks for listening. In this 8th episode of the podcast, I'll be exploring the last of my main themes for the series, that is the history of Scotland. If you haven't done so already, you can listen to the discussion of the other themes of the series in the earlier episodes. That is Episode 2 on the issues of European colonialism, exploitation and encounters with others, Episodes 3 and 4 on the Protestant Reformations, Episodes 5 and 6 on Islam and the idea of Europe, and then Episode 7 on the indelible stain of slavery. I live in Scotland, in the city of Perth, and the nation has been a very important part of my life. I feel it's worth the time to explore how thinking about Scotland and recalling its history is one of the many parts of this fluid prejudice of Histories Inc. To get started, there is a classic joke told about how God came to give Scotland to its people. It goes something like this. God told the Scottish people that the land they were being given would be perfect in every way. It was a land of high mountains and deep valleys, with rivers and lochs full of trout and salmon, and with herds of deer running over fields of purple heather. The air was fresh, the scenery was stunning, and there was everything you could ever want for. It was, in short, a brilliant wee country. However, the punchline went, God had a small joke for the Scots at the end of this. With a wicked smile, God said, "But just wait till you see who I've given you for neighbours." That is, of course, the English people, and in large part the powerful nation of England, ruled from the southern city of London. In September 2014, the people of Scotland were asked to vote in a referendum to decide whether or not they agreed that Scotland should become an independent country. The result was close, much closer than had first been expected, but not quite as close as late polls had suggested. 45% of the people voted in favour of Scottish independence, which of course wasn't enough to secure such a significant change. To understand the reasons for this vote and its potential and real impact, we have to understand what it was the people of Scotland were being asked to decide, and how it is that the contemporary nation of Scotland is not yet independent, and has not been so for several centuries. The entity of Scotland has roots going back over 1,000 years. It's a place defined perhaps by its geography, the northern part of the mainland island of Britain, together with numerous islands around its coast. Like any other nation, however, it's defined much more so by its history, and from that its sense of distinction. For many, the issue of Scotland has been for a long time, literally hundreds of years, defined by the people's relations with the English, their nearest neighbours. Scottish history has been in many ways a history of the successes and the difficulties of this relationship with England. In this episode, I aim to introduce the history of Scotland as part of this exploration of the ink with which history is written. That is, I don't intend to write the story of Scotland. That has been done many times by others who are far better qualified to do so than I am. As I explore the fluid prejudices of history within the context of history in and of Scotland, my hope is to bring to the fore certain histories, certain stories, events, ideas and people that have impacted on the wider world that we live in. There is no doubt that Scotland, a small place which has for most of its history been very poor, has had a tremendous impact on the global level. The phrase often used is that it has punched above its weight, and indeed continues to do so. A significant medium for it doing so has been the union that it entered into with England in the United Kingdom. For the past 300 years, since 1707, Scotland and England have been joined together as a single country, the United Kingdom of Great Britain, which also included Wales, and has also included Northern Ireland since 1800. Within the UK, Scotland and England have a joint monarch and parliament. In London, although since 1999 there's also been a secondary devolved Scottish Parliament in Edinburgh. Thus, from 1707 onwards, English and Scottish history have combined as British, particularly in relation to their foreign interventions. For example, the first English settlements of North America, such as Jamestown in 1607, were specifically English. At that point, Scotland was a separate country. At this time there were joint English and Scottish ventures, such as the colonial plantations established by them in Ireland, but in this each country acted separately, as a distinct nation. In contrast to this, however, by the time of the American Revolution in 1776, the colonial Americans were overthrowing a British rule, both English and Scottish, since by this time England and Scotland had joined to become the joint state of the British United Kingdom. To make this a little more complicated, however, for 100 years before the Union of 1707 that created the United Kingdom, there was another type of union between Scotland and England. This was from 1603 onwards, when the English and Scottish monarchies were united. Up until that time, the two separate countries had separate kings and queens, sometimes at peace with each other, but often in conflict. In 1603, the Scottish King James, who had ruled Scotland for nearly 20 years by that point as James VI, also became the King of England, following the death of the English Queen Elizabeth I. In effect, he moved from Edinburgh to London and stayed there, ruling England in large part, and Scotland as an afterthought. But from 1603 to 1607, the two countries remained independent of each other, even though they shared the same monarch. Therefore, specifically English history, particularly English colonial history, takes us to 1707, and from that date onwards there is British history and British colonialism. Of course, before 1707, Scots also had history, and even Scottish colonialism. And after 1707, both the Scots and English had distinct impacts on the development of their common nation's history. The development of Scotland as a nation is, however, much longer entwined with English history than this. It goes back for over a millennium. Indeed, the boundaries of what we now know as Scotland include areas that were once, to put it simplistically, part of what is now England. Thus, for several centuries up until the end of the first millennium, the Anglo-Saxon kingdom of Northumbria extended from York in the south to the River Forth in the north, including Edinburgh. It wasn't until around the year 950 that the Kingdom of Scotland, or Alba, took control of the areas around Edinburgh to the south of the Forth. It was just 70 years later that the present-day southern border of Scotland was established at the River Tweed, although for many centuries later the borders between Scotland and England were contested. Also, during the first part of the 11th century, between the years 1020 and 1050, around the time when the Scottish King Macbeth was in power, the western area of Strathclyde, that is Glasgow, the Clyde Valley, and the western coast of Ayrshire, were also incorporated into the Kingdom of the Scots. Before that time, the Kingdom of Alba, the Kingdom of Scots, had been an amalgamation of the two main cultural groups, the Scots who had emerged from the west from Ireland, and the Picts. Scottish historical legends assert that in the 9th century these two came together by force, when the Scottish king Kenneth MacAlpin defeated the Picts and incorporated them into his kingdom. In reality, however, the two groups had merged over the centuries, albeit in a land that didn't include many of the places, such as Glasgow, Edinburgh and the Central Belt, where the majority of the current Scottish population now live. And within this old kingdom of Alba, the crowning palace for the Scottish kings was the Abbey of Scoon, on the River Tay just to the north of Perth. And for many centuries Perth itself, because of its strategic location as a seaport with access to the remainder of the country, was a major centre for the kingdom. We shouldn't, however, think of Scotland as in any way urbanised for a considerable time after this. It wasn't until the first half of the 12th century that King David I created the boroughs that were an integral part of the creation of the modern Scottish nation. This Davidian revolution of the first decades of the 1100s was largely a result of his many years of living under English tutelage, and the urban borough system was taken directly from the English Norman society he knew so well, and which itself derived from the models of the Holy Roman Empire on the continent. Thus, with David in the 12th century, Scotland became feudal and in many respects modelled on English and other European socio-economic polities. It brought Scotland together in a systematic and centralised manner, and created the structure for the subsequent development of the nation in its recognisable form. Contemporary imagination of Scottish history cannot avoid the power of the Braveheart narrative, that is, the 1990s telling of the story of William Wallace's resistance to the English invasion of Scotland in the late 13th century. The English king, Edward I, also known as Edward Longshanks, invaded Scotland in 1296, and in doing so seized the historic crowning stone or stone of destiny from Scoon Abbey, which he then placed in Westminster Abbey in London to symbolise the incorporation of Scotland into the English Commonwealth under his crown. However, Scottish lords resisted this colonisation of the country by the English, as manifest by William Wallace, and in particular by the rise to power of King Robert Bruce. The first half of the 14th century saw a series of wars of independence by the Scots against English domination, which largely enabled Scotland to retain its independence, in contrast to the subjugation of Wales during the same era. History remembers this not only in terms of Wallace, Bruce, and the Scots' victory at the Battle of Bannockburn near Stirling, but also through the declaration made by the Scottish nobles in 1320, known as the Declaration of Arbroath, which includes the statement, "For, as long as but 100 of us remain alive, never will we on any conditions be brought under English rule. It is in truth not for glory, nor riches, nor honours that we are fighting, but for freedom, for that alone, which no honest man gives up but with life itself." There is a long history of intermarriage between the kings of Scotland and England. This goes back to the 11th century, with the marriage of Queen Margaret, the niece of the English King Edward the Confessor, to King Malcolm III, whose child was King David, as mentioned above. In 1424, Joan Beaufort, granddaughter of the powerful John of Gaunt, married the Scottish King James I during his captivity in England, and for a short time after 1437 she held power as Queen Regent following her husband James's murder in Perth. Perhaps the most significant of intermarriages between the Scottish and English monarchs was the marriage in 1503 of Margaret Tudor and James IV. Margaret was the older sister of England's King Henry VIII, and it is through her descendants that the English monarchy continued after the deaths of all three successors to Henry without issue, Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Margaret Tudor's granddaughter, Mary Queen of Scots, married her cousin, Henry Darnley, who was also a grandchild of Margaret, and it was their child who became King James VI of Scotland, and eventually King James I of England. It was through James VI and I that the crowns of England and Scotland were united in 1603, even though, as I've noted already, the union of the two nations didn't occur for a further 100 years. The figure of James VI and I is interesting in many ways, as the histories of Scotland, England, and the United Kingdom pivot very significantly on his life and his rule as king of both Scotland and subsequently England. His mother Mary was a Catholic during the time that the Reformation was transforming Europe. By the time that Mary reached maturity, Scotland had undergone the Reformation that started in 1559 with the pulling down of the kirks in Perth. To a large part, the romantically tragic story of Mary was caused by her Catholicism, in a time when the English Protestants were in ascendancy. Following her imprisonment and abdication of the Scottish crown, Mary escaped to England, where she was again imprisoned and held for 19 years by her cousin, the English Queen Elizabeth. Her captivity and eventual execution in 1587 were largely due to the potential threat that Mary represented, as the most obvious Catholic claimant on the English throne during an era when the English Reformation was by no means well established. Mary's son James was raised a Protestant by his Scottish nobles, and so became a legitimate successor to the English throne after the death of Elizabeth. Soon after he became the English king, the Gunpowder Plot of 1605 exposed the continuing Catholic-Protestant tensions in the nation, as did the unhappiness of a number of dissenting Puritan English Protestants who found James and the established Church of England that he oversaw as too close to the old Roman Catholic system and theology. A number of these Puritans eventually chose to escape from England and create pioneering new religious colonies in the New World, particularly in Massachusetts. Alongside this, it was early in the rule of James I that the first successful English colony was established in America, in Chesapeake Bay, in the settlement that became known as Jamestown from 1607. Although nearly a disaster when first settled, it eventually succeeded due to the development of tobacco farming in the colony, which brought revenue to the English crown and eventually fueled the reliance on the slave trade from Africa to build up profits from this inhuman use of cheap labour. James the Scot, who became the English king, also oversaw the significant development of both Scottish and English plantations of colonies in Ireland, attempting to largely expand and consolidate English domination of the island. The continuing separation of England and Scotland during the 17th century is perhaps best illustrated by the separate paths to colonialism that the two countries took. The English colonies in North America developed very rapidly during the 17th century, in Virginia, Massachusetts, and Newfoundland in particular, and then later through the acquisition of territories from Holland and Sweden, most significantly in particular the exchange of the Asian Spice Islands and the Caribbean territory of Suriname for New Holland, and in particular New Amsterdam, in 1667, which then, of course, became New York. In contrast to this, Scottish colonisation outside of Ireland was nowhere near so extensive. As its name suggests, early colonisation of Nova Scotia in the 1620s was led by Scots unsuccessfully, and in the 1680s there was a small settlement in New Jersey called Perth Amboy. In particular, most notoriously, there was the major colonial venture to the Isthmus of Panama at a place called Darien in the late 1690s. This proved to be disastrous for Scotland, largely due to the optimism and overinvestment that went into the colonial venture that was badly planned, badly executed, and also extremely high risk due to the conflict that it entailed with the dominant Spanish powers of the region. In short, the Darien colony failed, and took with it roughly 1/4 of the economy of Scotland, an unmitigated disaster for the country. It was largely as a result of the impact of the economic crash caused by the failure of the Darien scheme that the Act of Union was agreed, to unite Scotland with England in the United Kingdom in 1707. The story of Scotland didn't end with the Union, and indeed Scotland has had a major global impact in many different ways in the context, and largely because of its partnership with England. Scotland has indeed had a strong impact on the Union itself. Although starting as a junior partner in the 18th century, Scotland eventually prospered from the opportunities of the expansion and empire that England had already been developing. Figures such as the late 18th century politician Henry Dundas from Edinburgh have largely shaped British history. Alongside this, Scots have their own implication in the exploitation of the colonial projects. There is a close connection between the wealth of Scotland, both past and present, and Scots' investment and running of businesses in the Caribbean that exploited African slave labourers. Indeed, during the last years of the British slave system, as much as 1/3 of all slaves in Jamaica were owned by Scots. The close relationship between Scotland and slavery is manifest in contemporary names. Not only the central street of Glasgow, Buchanan Street, in memory of a wealthy slave owner, but also the Scottish family names of many African Caribbean people and their British descendants, such as Campbell, MacDonald, and so on. The famous Kingston Bridge over the Clyde in Glasgow refers to the dock area of the city of that name, which itself gave rise to the name of the Jamaican capital of Kingston. For Scotland, the slave trade and the nasty memory of it may seem very distant, having taken place across a wide ocean and in a different time. But it is also at the heart of the country that Scotland has become. Without slavery, Scotland today would be a very different place, much poorer, less educated, with less power. It was the profits of slavery that largely fueled Scotland's transformation during the Industrial Revolution, and turned the country from one of the poorest in Europe to one of the richest. And so, in conclusion, to return to the major currents of history that Scotland has been going through in the past few years, the issue of Scottish independence is still very much on the agenda in October 2015 as I record this episode. As I've written about in my book with this title, I believe that there shall be an independent Scotland. For me, it's something that is inevitable. What is most uncertain is how and when that will happen. I don't see this as something negative. Scotland won't move from its current geographic position, and it will continue to have a close relationship with its neighbour England and other parts of the region of Britain. The world is full of countries that were once joined with England and have since emerged as independent nations in their own right, not least the USA, Canada, Australia, India, and so on. I expect it will take some time for Scotland to become such an independent nation, perhaps not even in my lifetime, although I would like to be pleasantly surprised on this. It will happen when the people of Scotland see such independence as the best of options for the nation, which in part can happen when there is a broad and deep understanding not only of the present and future, but also the past. This is why I've included Scotland and its particular histories within the wider scope of this Histories Inc. podcast series. Scots have much to learn and interact with within the fluid prejudices of our histories, as indeed do many from far beyond Scotland. These threads through the podcast will emerge from time to time, of interest in themselves, and often strongly connected with the other themes in quite surprising ways. So, thanks for listening today. As usual, if you want to find out more about this topic and the podcast series, then there are more details on my website at mallorynie.com/histories-inc. There you can also get more details about my book on Scottish independence, There Shall Be an Independent Scotland, which you can also find on Amazon, iBooks and other online booksellers. I also have a short book on King James VI and I anti-smoking pamphlet called A Counterblast to Tobacco, which I've titled, from his phrase, This Vile Habit. And if you like this Histories Inc. podcast, and you're in a position where you would like to give some small support to it, then you can also pledge a small donation to help me with the running costs through the Patreon website, Patreon, patreon.com/MalloryNie. And of course, if you're listening to this on iTunes or Stitcher, don't forget to subscribe for free to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. And if you like the podcast, then do please leave a review. It helps other people to find the podcast on iTunes. That's all for today. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.